Welcome back to the second part of the Power of Partnerships, Defeating Onchocerciasis Symposium. We've heard mention of the importance of country ownership within a contextualized approach to NTDs going forward, and how homegrown philanthropy further opens up the doors to multi-sectoral approaches and partnership opportunities. Now, to set our minds thinking about this, a long-time friend and tireless supporter of onco efforts, General Danjuma, sent in a special message. Now, some of you know he was so moved by the many people suffering from river blindness in his home state in Nigeria that he made a substantial dollar donation to the World Bank Trust Fund for APOC. He needed more, I think I would say we would need more like him scattered around the endemic countries. But General Danjuma's message will be read by Francisca Olamiju, the CEO of Mitosat, a local Nigerian NGDO through which the donation was made. Let's listen in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Francisca Olamiju. I'm the Executive Director of Mitosat. General T.Y. Danjuma, the Grand Patron of Mitosat, has asked me to represent him at this event. I bring you his best wishes as I read his letter of support. Thank you. I'm happy to be part of this event and a proud partner in the elimination of river blindness in sub-Saharan Africa. This disease of poverty should be eliminated in my states, Nigeria, Africa, and wherever it is found globally. I believe control has been achieved, but elimination has not been achieved in some parts of Africa. I'm happy for my contributions to my country since 1995 through Mitosat and Sub-Saharan Africa through APOC to accelerate the elimination of river blindness. However, it seems the partners are getting tired, and I would like to encourage all stakeholders to step up their actions and ensure that future generations are freed from the menace of this disease. The collective gain towards control must not be lost. I look forward to the day the world will celebrate the elimination of this disease of poverty. I congratulate Bruce Benton, the Global Task Force, and stakeholders for the achievement and wish you all success. Thank you.
Well, certainly a call to action from General Danjuma, which I'm sure we'll get to hear more from some of the other speakers later in the agenda. Now, in the present landscape, with an overarching vision of SDGs and One Health, what does the future hold for onco? Lessons learned and reshaped. What more is needed to deliver on the roadmap targets and achieve the impact needed? This will be part of the next panel discussion that will be chaired by Professor Gilbert Burnham and joined by Mark Rosenberg. Gilbert is a professor at Bloomberg School of Public Health, the Johns Hopkins University, and is also the Mitosat Expert Committee Chair. Mark, as most of you already know, is the former president and CEO of the Task Force for Global Health. But before they begin their session, let's take a moment to hear from the current Merck Chairman of the Board, President and Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Kenneth Frazier, who sent in this special message looking towards the future.
I'm honored to be invited to share a few words with you all today. At the start of a new decade, and with the launch of the new 2021 to 2030 roadmap for neglected tropical diseases, it's a great time to step back and reflect on our more than 30-year history of helping to bring hope and better health to those afflicted by river blindness and lymphatic filariasis. A time to celebrate the success of what we've accomplished with our partners, and a time to look ahead to the new global targets and what we need to do together to help achieve them. The Mectizan Donation Program is a story of scientific discovery, visionary leadership, novel ideas in public health, and extraordinary commitment from many people, organizations, and communities. The innovative science and Merck's commitment to donate Mectizan as much as needed for as long as necessary to treat river blindness was only the beginning. Getting the medicines to the people who needed it in countries and remote communities that lacked the healthcare infrastructure required the unique skills of the Task Force for Global Health, the World Bank, and WHO and many NGOs, other partners, and countries working together as a team. The Mectizan Donation Program created a new standard for what organizations and partnerships can achieve. The collaboration, commitment, and determination are paying off. We're witnessing disease elimination as a reality. Today, river blindness is no longer a public health problem worldwide, and transmission has been stopped in 4 Latin American countries. Lymphatic filariasis has been eliminated as a public health problem in Togo, Yemen, and Malawi. And the community-directed approach, empowering trained community volunteers to distribute the medicine, has allowed additional health services to reach remote communities and served as a model for subsequent global health programs. Younger generations can now work, play, and enjoy life without the same fear of these terrible diseases. The program has helped alleviate suffering, let people live healthier, more productive lives, and reduce the economic burden on some of the world's poorest communities. But there's still much more to be done. We can't lose momentum and must strengthen our partnerships to support the 2030 global NTD goals to eliminate the transmission of river blindness and the public health problem of LF in endemic countries. It is an honor and a privilege for me to reaffirm Merck's long-term commitment to helping rid the world of these disabling diseases. On behalf of everyone at Merck, I'd like to thank our many partners for your continued support and unwavering dedication to helping make river blindness and lymphatic filariasis diseases of the past. Thank you.
Perfect segue to our session titled Lessons Learned and Current and Future Applications, chaired by Professor Gilbert Burnham and joined by Mark Rosenberg. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia. And I think this was a lovely video, and we're very deeply appreciated for this continuing support from Merck, and I think this goes without saying. We're also very appreciative to Bruce Benton for his superb book in cataloging and commemorating and documenting all the twists and turns that we went through to get to where we are now. And of course, one of the key themes to this success has been the role of partnerships, partnerships right from the community to national, to international level, to regional levels. And so I think we've done a great job at looking at those things, and it's been great to have so many participants from that time who've been involved. And now I think our chance is to look at those lessons and say, how do we move those lessons forward? How do we take them forward toward the goals of elimination? And as we know, partnerships don't just happen. They take a lot of vision, they take a lot of careful nurturing, and they take a lot of hard work. So in this session, we're going to talk about some of the principles that we've learned in the process and how we can apply these going forward. And looking at those who worked in these, in the process, in the cycles, and what they've learned and how they're going to share those. Now, one of the things we want to do with this afternoon session, which we haven't managed to do yet, is to get some questions and some comments from our participants. And we have a large number of people online, and so we want you to note down some comments as we go along. And we're going to start right off with Mark Rosenberg. And as we all know, Mark was the president and chief executive of the task force from 2000 to 2016, a long tenure. And before that time, he had a very distinguished career at the CDC, working with a number of conditions. So he's going to look at some of the successes in public health and some of the controls of disease, and drawing some lessons from leaders and identifying some of the principles that we can use moving forward. So, Mark, we're going to turn some time over to you and to the audience. If we have a little bit of time left at the end of Mark's comments, let's take a question or two from you, and then we'll move on to our next keynote. So, Mark, we're over to you now.
Thanks, Gil, and thanks, Patricia, for the warmth that you bring to this event. Much appreciated. And I must say that as I look at my screen, I have a Zoom screen showing all the participants in this event. I am really humbled by this. What an extraordinary group of people. And I think what you are doing is showing us how to become better ancestors. When we work together, the lesson here is we can change the world. And I think because of MDP, the future is not what it used to be. And that's a striking statement. The future is not what it used to be. And I don't need to remind any of us in this day today that onco is not the only disease we're struggling with. One other disease was smallpox. And in 1980, the World Health Organization, disease of mankind, had been eradicated. And right now, the lessons from smallpox eradication have never been more relevant as the world struggles with the coronavirus threat to get that threat under control. To be good ancestors, we need to leave the world better than how we found it. And when dealing with the global health problems of today, whether they're outbreaks of COVID-19, Ebola, or SARS, or diseases that are in their last mile like polio or guinea worm, we face some of the same challenges that smallpox eradication faced. If we can look at the first slide here, the high-level lessons that we've learned from smallpox are relevant to what we're doing now. These are the lessons from Bill Foege, who was the architect of the strategy that led to the eradication of smallpox, the same man who put together the task force and was the first executive director of the Mechanism donation program. I'm just going to run through these lessons quickly. They apply to almost every disease we work on. The first is, this is a cause and effect world. If we understand the causes, we can change the effects. We can change them for the better. This basically says science is what holds the answers to how we proceed. Second, know the truth. Surveillance can provide us with that truth. Even when the truth is unpopular, we need to know it and share it. Third, coalitions are absolutely essential. And I'll come back to that lesson. Fourth, avoid certainty. It's the Achilles heel of science. Fifth, build in evaluation and continuous improvement. We've heard how important that is again and again. Six, respect the culture. Culture matters. We're not doing something for people. We're not doing something to people. We're working with people. Respect their culture. Seven, the best decisions are based on the best science, but the best results are based on the best management. And here I want to give a shout out to Brenda Colatrella, just one example of how important good management is. Usually when a CEO starts a program, his or her successors want to start their own programs. It would have been so easy to let go of what Roy Vagelos had started, but Brenda hung in there. And Brenda, who I see smiling, made sure that each successive CEO of Merck kept this program in their forefront and kept it going. This is an unheralded hero of global health. 8, the best solutions move us closer to global health equity. If we can do something that benefits everyone equally, we follow the golden rule, do unto others as we would like it done unto us, we are so much better off. And 9, with political will, anything is possible. Without it, nothing is. Sometimes we in global health say, if only we didn't have to deal with politics. Well, global health works through politics. It's inherently political. And Bill Foege has pointed out, it's not that politicians are the problem. The problem is bad politicians. Let me come back to lesson 3. Coalitions are essential. And let's focus on the Mecdizan coalition, because this is a coalition that has changed history. Mecdizan donation program was housed at the Task Force for Child Survival, and that is now the Task Force for Global Health. And as we've heard, it's a really good example of a coalition because of 2 unique characteristics. First, it was not headed by any UN agency. It was not led or controlled by a multilateral or a bureaucracy. And second, a corporation, a private corporation, made this coalition work. Merck provided the science, the product, and the inspiration. The task force provided a mechanism. WHO provided technical expertise, and the World Bank developed a program to provide funds for distribution. President Carter and the Carter Center provided a major surge as he personally enlisted the interest and the heads of state for Africa. As you heard, there were dozens of non-governmental organizations involved, and ministries of health were involved. So the coalition was really driven by a corporation, an ex-president, and an NGO that brought them all together and provided a power that had been previously unknown in global health. The next slide. What will ultimately make elimination possible is the ability to continue to bring multiple stakeholders together. In effect, the ability to form a coalition. Indeed, solving any large-scale global health problem is going to require a coalition. These global health problems are too big for any one person, for any one organization, even for your bureaucratic organization to do it by itself. At the task force, we studied and put together the lessons of successful coalitions, and we put them together in a task force book called Real Collaboration. Here's what effective coalitions require. First, a clear, overriding, and shared common goal. The most important thing. Without that, we can't keep a coalition together. And when times get tough, that's what will keep it together. Second, a strategy for achieving that goal. Third, a structure for the coalition. It doesn't have to be a large, formal, organizational chart structure, but it needs a structure. It needs some organization. Fourth, defined membership. Who's going to be part of it? And the membership needs to be not all similar, but it needs to be complementary. We need organizations and people that bring different sets of skills together. And fifth, it needs effective management of both meetings and programs and people. Meetings, programs, and people all need to be managed well across the whole journey, following the roadmap until we reach the final mile. And in terms of management, we learned some lessons about this. One is shed the light on our partners and not on ourselves. There's enough credit to go around. Credit is infinitely divisible. Share it, don't grab it. Second, social capital is really important. The relationships among people are really important. The people in coalitions, the people we're talking about are just people. You know how complicated we are. We're like you, we are you. Without these 5 elements, the goal, the strategy, the structure, the membership, and the management, without those, coalitions fail. Most coalitions fail. to achieve their objectives. I like to say that a coalition is like a marriage. It's very easy to get into it, but it's very hard to make it work. I used to argue with people who told me, no, my marriage is not hard. I don't struggle. We never fight. And I used to argue with them like a fool. I'd argue until I realized that some people, when they say that, just lie. It's hard. Coalitions are messy. They're big. They're complicated. And there are obstacles at every level. The next slide shows some of these obstacles. A colleague, Jim Austin, a professor emeritus from the Harvard Business School, went through these 7 C's, he calls them. We have different cultures. We have conflicting goals. We're confused about what the very goals are. People struggle for control. We have different capabilities. We tend to think that the most capable people are just like us, when in fact, what we need are the people with very different skills, and we fail to appreciate them usually. Competition. I bet you've never even thought that different organizations compete for money, for attention, for country, and compete for credit. They do. And finally, the cost. Coalitions take money and resources to run and to keep them together. Most foundations don't put money into building and keeping the coalition going. It's so essential. And finally, we've heard it mentioned, the last C is conflict. When you have conflict among countries, whether it's terrorism or external threats, it's a threat to the coalition. The Mectizan donation program brought an extraordinarily high return for the investment of Merck in terms of disease and disability prevention, employee morale, and a positive company name recognition. And Merck's success, the success of MVP, brought other pharmaceutical companies into the game. So now it's not just Merck, but GSK is donating albendazole to control soil-transmitted helminths, and LF. Johnson & Johnson is donating mebendazole for soil-transmitted helminth. Merck Serono is donating praziquantel for schisto. Eisai is donating DEC. Pfizer is donating Zithromax for trachoma. Novartis for malaria and leprosy, and more and more and more. And funds are being donated for implementation by USAID and DFID and Geneva Global and more, and for operational research that Frank highlighted so well by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and more. These donations are rewriting and changing history. The MDP example and its replicates involving GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson now reach hundreds of millions of people. It's hard to conceive of what millions mean. It's harder to conceive of what hundreds of millions mean, but it means the world has been changed. These are people who were at risk for NTD, and we're making a difference for them and for other major global health problems. Some people may think it's politically incorrect to thank a pharmaceutical company, but in this case, saying thanks is insufficient. From millions who've been spared the loss of sight and even more spared the burden of itching, there's no adequate way to thank Merck. There's no adequate way to thank all of you who have contributed to this. And those of us privileged to work in a program like this that has provided such joy, we're grateful. The last slide, Merck and their partners, all of you have rewritten history. Those of you who have touched this program, who have worked on it, and for it, you will be better ancestors. And I know that for me, knowing that I'm part of a group that is becoming better ancestors, well, that takes away some of the sting of this coronavirus pandemic. I hope you all can feel this way. The future is no longer what it used to be. Thanks to you all.
Mark, thank you very much for reminding us of our ancestral responsibilities here. And thanks for bringing back some of these principles and some of these goals that we've built a lot of our activities on in the past, and they're still very valid as we move ahead looking toward elimination and toward some of the challenges for the future. Now, we've not got any questions yet, but please send in your questions because we're running well on time now. So I think we're going to have some time for some questions. But I think at this point, we'll move on to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Berger Friedrichsen. And Mr. Friedrichsen has worked for 20 years at the World Bank as Director of Human Development for Africa. He's written very widely on educational development issues, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and looking at the areas of effectiveness of developmental aid. And that last piece, I think, is a great introduction to what Berger is going to talk to us about. We looked at some of the global issues, and now we're going to move to some of the regional issues. So, Berger, we'll turn the next 10 minutes over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to talk about the benefits of regional approaches. As emphasized by earlier speakers, effective partnerships were key to the success of the ONCO program. However, as they have also emphasized, there should be no doubt about the many challenges involved in building and maintaining for decades such a complex multi-sectoral partnership as the ONCO program was. In my view, the effectiveness of this unique partnership depended crucially on the remarkable ability of the key players in the many partner institutions involved to jointly resolve the many challenges encountered. And we are lucky to have many of these players among us today. So what can we learn from the ONCO program about the role of regional partnerships in producing the type of regional and global public good functions needed to address challenges that no country can successfully address alone? The need for effective partnerships, as well as the challenges of maintaining them, are growing in today's globalized and multipolar world, where nationalism is on the rise and the value of multilateralism is questioned. I'll focus on lessons in two areas: effective program implementation and mobilization of sustainable long-term funding. In my view, in my experience, the success in both areas hinges on the ability to harness the strong synergy with regional and global approaches. For example, to mobilize sustainable funding for regional approaches depend closely on the convening power and support of effective global institutions. And the success of global institutions in fund mobilizations depend closely on the effective program implementation facilitated by regional approaches. For most of its duration, those managing the ONCO program demonstrated outstanding ability to harness this synergy. So the first point I want to talk about is implementation. Based on my 5 decades experience of working on education, health, and economic issues in sub-Saharan Africa, I will claim that the key obstacle to improving living conditions in the region is not lack of ambitious policies and plans, but poor implementation of such plans. And a key reason is often the inadequate attention is paid to the complex political economy factors that lead to extensive, in my view, elite capture of public resources to the detriment of the poor. So be able to focus the policies on the poor, I think is a key problem. I'll highlight 3 lessons from the ONCO program for how regional approaches can help address such factors, and then contrast them with my experience from working on education and economic issues in Africa. Program relevance is the first one. The regional approaches increases the likelihood of adapting both research priorities and the content of social, economic, and culture to the social, economic, and cultural context of the intended beneficiary. In turn, increased relevance facilitates innovation, as well as building national political ownership to the policies. Both are essential for effective implementation. The ONCO program was a pioneer in this area, as exemplified by Africa-wide operational research and innovative method for community-directed Mectizan treatment and regional disease control modeling. The second point I would like to emphasize is capacity building from regional approaches. Through peer learning and knowledge exchange, regional approaches help build the political will and commitment to adapt policies requiring difficult political choices and the technical capacity to implement them. They also enable drawing on competitive strength of a diverse set of national institutions. The OCO program's Cascade training, for example, did an excellent job in this area. I want to underscore this capacity building effect of regional approaches using examples from respectively the education and economic sector. Poor institutional capacity is a major reason why only 1/3 of those starting school in sub-Saharan Africa gain basic literacy. Evaluation shows that the huge amount of country-specific aid over the last 4 decades for capacity building in the education sector, largely funding long-term resident foreign experts and training abroad, have resulted in very little lasting capacity in the sector. By comparison, considerable success has been achieved the last 2 decades in strengthening key economic and financial institutions through technical cooperation between countries, supported by 6 largely donor-funded regional capacity building centers in sub-Saharan Africa created since 2002. These are 6 out of 14 such centers created worldwide. The third point is the poverty focus and equity. One notable success of the ONCO program is that it managed to build global and national commitment to combat a neglected disease that largely affect poor rural populations with little political voice. Regional approaches to both the goal setting and program focus are important to enhance implementation. Permit me again to illustrate with an example from education. Even before COVID-19, it was clear that most sub-Saharan African countries will not achieve universal primary education by 2030, a goal that was first agreed in 1961 for 1980. And yet, contrary to earlier global goals, the Sustainable Development Goal for Education for 2030 has no separate target prioritizing primary education, because this is now largely a regional sub-Saharan Africa program and was not built into this global goal. For me, this is an illustration of how global goals not adjusted to the demographic, education, and economic conditions of a region where more than 1/3 of all births over the next 2 decades will be to illiterate mothers, in a region that by 2050 will account for 30% of the world youth population, and where 80 to 90% of the population gain their livelihood in the informal sector. So I claim that the global goals were not sufficiently adjusted to the economic, education, and demographic situation in Africa. Moving now to the second point I wanted to illustrate, that is the mobilization of sustainable funding for regional approaches. I will highlight 3 lessons that I draw from the ONCO program. The first is that the proactive ONCO program management succeeded in maintaining sustained support by keeping all partners informed and engaged. The success is all the more remarkable given the severe underfunding of regional and global public good functions in most sectors. This problem, now illustrated by the funding gap for the COVID-19 vaccine for poor countries, requires urgent global attention. In addition to the need for more aid, there is also a need for improving the effectiveness of current aid by focusing it more on the area where external aid has comparative advantage over domestic funding. This would include increased priority for regional and global public good functions and for increasing the level of core funding on global and regional agencies. The growing reliance of such agencies on voluntary earmarked contribution raises many questions ranging from the quality of aid to the governance and accountability of such agencies. The second point I want to stress is the importance of pooled non-earmarked funding. The World Bank played a key role in creating, replenishing, and managing the pooled ONCO Trust Fund, as well as in contributing own funding. It is hard to overstate the importance of this non-earmarked funding mechanism for a program that must address all effective areas to eliminate the disease. Relying on bilateral funding would pose the risk of underfunding for some countries, given the tendency for such funding to focus on a few donor-darling countries. The last point I want to stress is the rising role of the private sector. The book documents well the crucial role played by Merck's development and donation of Mectisan and by philanthropists. Given the chronic underfunding of global public good functions, the last 2 decades' rapid growth in funding by philanthropists is an encouraging trend, especially if directed towards global public goods. For example, only 3% of total global education aid is for global public good, only 3%. The share is estimated to be around 21% for health. But this higher figure does not, of course, mean that health global public goods are well funded. Rather, the positive impact of vaccine and special programs such as ONCO in controlling transmissible diseases are much better understood than are the wide-ranging negative impacts of that the illiteracy rate for adult women in sub-Saharan Africa has stagnated around 40% illiterate, 2 in 5 are illiterate. In conclusion, I want to congratulate Bruce for the excellent and dedicated work he did on the OCO program in the bank, and for this excellent book documenting the success story, as well as the contributions of so many other people who are also present today. Thank you.
So Berger, thank you very much. That was a lovely and very succinct summary of some of the key things that you've learned, and also how we can apply some of the things that you've learned in education to this specific area as well. So at this point, I want to put out another plea for some comments or questions about what our first 2 keynote speakers have said. And while you're writing the questions down, we're going to move on to our panel. And we have 3 people on the panel, and these are people who've been either mentioned in the book, or they have been implied in the book because they've all been involved in various ways in many activities with onchocerciasis control over the years. And so we're going to look at people from various aspects and what kind of lessons that they've learned in the development of partnerships and how they've seen this developed, and very importantly, how they can potentially take this forward into looking toward elimination activities. And first on our list is Dr. Tony Uketti. And Tony is an ophthalmologist now in Eastern DRC, but for many years he was at WHO headquarters in Geneva, involved with NGDO activities and partnerships for prevention of blindness, and also focal point for onchocerciasis elimination, and kind of the editor of a number of different documents and manuals over the years. So I've asked Tony to talk a little bit about his kind of take on what are some of the key principles that we need to look at as we're taking these partnerships forward. So Tony, let's give this time over to you, next 5 minutes, to talk about your perceptions.
Thank you very much, Gilbert, for this nice introduction. And I would like also to thank the organizers. And I refer here to Bruce Benton himself, who visited me when I was in Geneva, interviewing me while he was collecting data and information in order to write the book. And also, I would like to acknowledge here Mark, whom I met several times during my visit in Atlanta. We exchanged a lot. He offered me a book as well. He wrote on collaboration. And yeah, so many people here. I'm very happy to see you. I'm now based in northeastern Congo. Right now, I'm in Revi. It's a village trying to develop a center for research on neglected tropical diseases near Uganda border. It's only 45 kilometers to reach Uganda border near Arua. You know, it's not very easy to talk among the last people. It's not easy. And you have said a lot. I'm going to share with you my personal experience in the principles and processes of successful partnerships. With regard to principles, I've only picked up 3 of them. And I'm just coming back to what so many people have already mentioned. In my opinion, number 1, I entitled it Common Interest. Partners should have common interest. Some called it clear objectives within the partnership. This may explain why it was sometimes difficult for FAO or UNDP and other donors who did not participate in EPOC partnership, whereas they were part of the first program, the OCP. Number 2, trust. Absence of trust leads to misunderstandings and conflicts with sometimes risk of divorce. I think Mark mentioned that one. Number 3, I think many people have mentioned that. I've just put it as coordination and collaboration among so many partners. In order to prevent these risks, there is a need for a very good coordination and a smooth collaboration among these various partners. Let us move on to the processes. I will start with what I put here, vision and passion. Simon Bush from Sightsavers and I think someone else during this teleconference mentioned Sir John Wilson, who accidentally became blind at the age of 12 in a chemistry laboratory at school. Together with his wife, Lady Jean Wilson, they took part in a 9-month tour just after the Second World War in 1946. And in 1947, they visited several countries in Africa. They went to Middle East. And at that time, they were so touched by the needs the world was presenting. Shocked at the scale of blindness he witnessed, he returned home very determined to do something about what he saw. In Ghana, in particular, they were so touched by those affected by onchocerciasis, unable to pronounce this terrible disease, onchocerciasis. Allow me to remind you that even one time when I was in Geneva, the WHO director was unable to pronounce properly onchocerciasis. So the wife, Lady Jean, named the disease river blindness. And on the 5th of January, 1950, Sir John Wilson founded the British Empire Society for the Blind, known today as Sightsavers. He also founded in early 70s the International Agency for the Prevention of Blindness, IPB, and became its first president. For me, this is a prototype of a real visionary who traveled, decided now to go to my second principle, which is advocacy. He started after visiting all these disasters in the world. He conducted intense and effective advocacy at international level. And he met Mr. Robert McNamara, president of the World Bank at that time, and convinced him to visit West Africa.
Tony, in the last
real
minute, could
visionary.
you give us your third point in the last minute, and then we're going to move on.
And the last one, I think the last one is empowerment. We need to empower people. So far, at the national level, we have so many powerful people. We need to focus at the national level, starting from the community up to the national level. Program managers, we need to empower them in order to undertake their duties properly. Countries with good managers, no problem, we cannot care about them. But there were countries where program managers sometimes decided to go to the regional level because there was gold there. That's a case in Angola. In Chad, we saw good program managers. He was able to mobilize money even from Chad, which is considered a poor country.
And so Tony,
in summary,
that's a great summary.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I stop there, and you can write to me, and then we can share our own experience. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, there are questions coming in, so Tony will give you some airtime later on. But I think now we want to go to Catherine Marshall. And Catherine is a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And once that she gets that solved, then she moves on to areas that deal with some international partnerships and other issues. But she was a manager at the World Bank for a number of years, 1971 to 2006, a long tenure there. And we read, Catherine, a lot about you in Bruce's book. So I'm going to turn some time over to you to look at some of the lessons that have been learned from international partnerships. What's worked well, where things have fallen apart, and what your observations are for the future.
Great. Well, I'm going to divide my 5 minutes, which goes by very quickly, into two parts. One is my sort of current obsessions and some of the broader questions and issues. And the second, go back into my World Bank days and think about the World Bank. I read Bruce's book in parallel, roughly at the same time as reading Paul Farmer's new book, Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds. And it evoked a lot of thoughts about the challenges that remain, particularly on health, but more broadly in Africa, and particularly in the parts of Africa where the ONCO program began. In many ways, what you see through the story here is the evolution, the history of thinking about development, including some of the challenges. And it's almost epitomized by the journey from development by helicopter to the depth of working at the community level. But in terms of my own thinking, I'm working now the two things in this region that are on my mind 24 hours a day are the COVID situation and the COVID vaccine challenges, but also the Ouagadougou Partnership, which deals with family planning issues, family issues, and takes you, as does ONCO, right into the basic health systems. So one of my questions is how far the health is really integrated with the rest of development. And there is a separate chapter on what happened with the actual changes in agriculture and people's lives in Bruce's book. But I think it still leaves many questions as to making those complex links between the development. And we have to ask whether any of the dramas happening in Burkina, in Nigeria, in Mali, were things we maybe should have foreseen. All of us collectively, and might have done more to do something about them. My current focus, Jim Wolfenson is responsible for getting me into it, is looking at what is a huge world, particularly in Africa more than any other continent, which is the whole world of religion. And I ask myself whether if we had thought more and looked more at the religious dimensions, whether we might have learned something. Certainly in the COVID crisis, that is an immediate and a very relevant issue. So some of these issues, it's complicated, but the health challenges, the onco challenges, and the way that they were part of the broader issues, the rage that Paul Farmer shows about the poor development of health systems still in that part of the world. With those tantalizing comments, I think I'll shift to the World Bank. In many ways, my view of the World Bank's story in this ONCO partnership is the World Bank at its best. The World Bank is not always at its best. We all know its hiccups and its quirks. But in this case, I think an analogy that we might find useful is of an orchestra. And the World Bank was able at times to play a constructive role as a conductor of these many very different parts of the partnership. But as Berger has highlighted so eloquently and Jean-Louis has referred to, there were many challenges in the face of doing this. For the World Bank, working regionally was and remains very difficult because of the very strong country focus that is built in, baked in to the World Bank. But there are other things that I think Bruce highlights that are really worth thinking about. One, and again, we heard about this before, the role of meetings, which people can be quite cynical about, that the roles, the orchestrated, carefully prepared meetings played an enormously important role in keeping people informed, giving them voice, making the country's part, but also giving voice even to the piccolo, the very small groups. The financing mechanisms and the accountability and the way that those were linked to the research and to the technical side were very critical. And coming down just as a final point, I'm teaching now courses in development ethics. And many of the issues that we're looking at today are basically about some of the ethics in development. And to me, one of the critical issues in ethics in development is priorities. And it comes out in strategies. We often say that a strategy is about what you don't do as well as what you do, and about the how. But it was somehow managing to keep the balance between keeping a constant focus, a recognition that if the ONCO program did not last, if it was not sustained, if it was allowed to lapse, all of the benefits would disappear. And to keep that in mind at the same time that one was dealing with malaria, with AIDS, with all of the other challenges, the education challenges, the roles of women, the roles of jobs, all of those different issues were all coming into play. And I think this effort to keep the ONCO program at the center was absolutely critical to its success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I know you could go on. And in fact, I see one of the questions that's coming up that will go definitely to you. But let's turn over the last comments here, last 5 minutes to Boachi Boatin. And Boachi spent many years with onchocerciasis and was the last manager for the OCP program. And he's worked on a lot of activities since that time. And he's going to reflect back on his experience with OCP and draw some lessons here in the last 5 minutes. And we want to be sure we leave some time for questions because I see 2 great questions anyway, and probably more coming in. So Boachi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gilbert. If you can all hear me, first of all, congratulations to Bruce for a very nice book. I enjoyed reading it. And thank you all for participating. It's nice to see you all. In 5 minutes, I'll try and summarize a few points, but being the last speaker, most of the points that I'm going to summarize have already been said, so I'm not going to take your time. I was chatting with one of the coordinators of OCP at one time, and he just suddenly stopped and he said, OCP APOC these are schools. And I just looked at him, I wondered what was the problem. He said, look, he's learned so much from these two programs. He wonders how that can be taken on to tackle other diseases that are afflicting Africa. I said, well, there are many areas that one can look at which we can use to tackle other areas, diseases in Africa. I'm going to try and look at 5 points, and very briefly, I'll indicate what is unique about these points that we've learned. First of all, the community. For a long time, one had been talking about community participation, community involvement, but as Michelle Parker said, nobody talked about community empowerment. Once we got into that stream, and we realized that if you inform the communities adequately, if you tell them what the whole thing is about, they are the ones that have the disease. If they understand you, if they accept what you said, they'll do everything for themselves. They help the Ministry of Health par excellence. They become, in one word, allies to the Ministry of Health in solving and helping with other delivery systems in the country. The second group of people that I would like to mention is the national coordinators or the program managers. These coordinators, if you like, were a link between the programs and the ministries of health. If you wanted to get to the Minister of Health, you talk to the national coordinator, he would find a way. That was a very easy passage. They understood the program, they briefed the ministers listened to us, and whatever help we needed from the governments, they provided. Secondly, the coordinators had exchange programs. They used to move from one country to the other, and they exchanged ideas which helped each other country. The third point about the national coordinators, just like all of us, was that they understood that we had a common aim. There was no conflict, everybody was shooting at the same target, and there was coordination and there was partnership in the way they handled their programs. The third point is the ministries, or if you like, the governments themselves. Here it was very important to get what we call the government commitment and the will. If these governments had no commitment and the will, there was no way that we could have the partnerships and the way the programs ran. In fact, at one time it was said that the ministers of health had become so, if you like, personalized in their relationships that two countries that were at hostilities with each other agreed to suspend the hostilities for larviciding to be carried out within a certain period. I will not mention the countries in point, but that's the sort of relationship that one had between the ministers of health and the governments. On top of that, the ministers of health would talk to the ministers of finance, the ministers of agriculture, because as you said before in all the presentations, this had been a development program, not only a health program. So here was a situation where ministers of health that had never seen their finance ministers were met to talk to each other. Although there was no commitment for financing, there was goodwill from the ministers. On top of that, they were also prepared to second staff from their programs to come and help with the programs as we set them up. Some of them became temporary staff, some of them became permanent staff. And some of these individuals can be used in handling other programs that are being set up, particularly the NTD programs.
So, Bwachi, I think we'll maybe, if it's okay with you, we'll take a pause at that point because I see a number of questions coming in. So I'm going to turn it over to David. Do you want to pick out a good question to start with?
Thank you very much, Gil. There's a question for Dr. Rosenberg, which others might be able to address as well. That is, the coalitions need constant renewal. APOC is closed. ESPN is relatively small and has a variety of responsibilities beyond onchocerciasis. The World Bank and UNDP are no longer involved in onchocerciasis control as they were. Can onco-elimination be achieved without a renewal or a renaissance? And then if I could just add one more, Gil, related to this, question is whether we are at risk of losing sight of the specific elimination goals with our increased integration in other NTDs, this constant tension between focus and integration. How do we manage that as a partnership?
All right, those are two great questions to start off with. And all right, so maybe then, Catherine, that's an area that you might want to talk about. And I think certainly we can ask some of the other panel members as well.
I think they're tough questions, and it's the vertical versus the horizontal that we're confronting all the time. And it is also necessary to recognize that different countries have different views of priorities and therefore different commitments. I do think that having a role of some kind of orchestra conductor, whether it is a multiple sets of diseases and issues, or whether particularly on these diseases where success is clearly interconnected and regional in its dimensions, is helpful. And missing that makes it much more difficult. The question of competing priorities, which I've mentioned at different times, I think comes into play. The answer that we're giving to almost every question that's asked these days is it's complicated, and I would give it here too.
Okay, I think that's a good way to pass it off. And maybe Berger, do you want to address this as well? Do you have any thoughts looking at programs from other sectors as well?
Thank you. I think I will subscribe to Catherine's answer that this is complex. And if I look at the education sector now, the reason why we are not able to reach universal primary education is really a question of prioritization. And this means really prioritizing education for the poor over secondary and higher education for those who are more privileged, but for whom there are no jobs in the sector, since 80 to 90% of the people are working in the informal sector. So these priorities are really very, very difficult. So that didn't answer the health question, but I mean, the prioritization is really a very difficult problem, and people have different views on what the priorities should be.
But I think it also brings up a point that that's been a theme throughout Bruce's book, but also that Tony just brought up about the importance of advocacy there and how we're really falling down in that area. But I want to move on to another question. So I think we'll take two more questions. So David, do you want to pick another one for us, and for that the panel is just waiting to hear?
Sure, thank you, Gil. There's many questions coming in now. Let me just bring two of them to our attention. One is how to foster and improve national financial support for the ongoing effort to eliminate onchocerciasis. And then a question for a question related to the expansion of the NTD program. There's many new partners, particularly NGDOs, that have been brought involved in this, many of them not involved in eye care. And how have the other partners facilitated integration of new partners into the program, and what have the challenges been there? Thank you.
Oh, all right, so thanks very much. I think I'm going to take the second question first, the one about new partners, and I think that this is just the kind of question that Tony wants to be asked. So Tony, we're integrating new partners into this that maybe have not had a lot of experience with onchocerciasis in the past, and how do we get them oriented and into the picture and working as part of the coalition?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think for new partners, the way to go would be to see how at the country level partners can coach themselves. As the NGDOs were organized at the international level, I was coordinating it. And also at each country, at the country level, there was what we used to call the national coalition. And the typical one was in Nigeria with so many partners. They used to have their own meetings within the country, and also they were helping each other and trying to have one voice within the country. So at the country level, I think there is an opportunity of coaching each other.
All right. Well, I think that's great. Learning from each other. I think that's an excellent way that we've been doing in education for a long time. And then we have the final question about finances, and I'm going to pass that one back to Catherine to answer. And then we're going to move on to our next panel. And so, Catherine, the final question was about finances.
Another tough one. Clearly, we're dealing with multiple issues here because of multiple countries and partnerships. So, and I think it does come back to this advocacy issue, that if the ministers of finance in each of the countries involved don't see the elimination of ONCO, but other health goals as a priority within their contexts, as well as feasible and something that they understand, they're not going to make the kind of allocations of finances that are absolutely critical. And of course, the same applies with the donors, that they're facing multiple demands, multiple opportunities to do good as they would see it. And so it is a constant question of persuasion. I would also come back to these very mundane, in many ways, issues of the financing mechanism that were described in some of the presentations and that Bruce goes into in some detail in his book as to how it actually worked, how you were able to establish enough assuredness of a reliable financing mechanism that had the accountability attached to it, that people were able to implement the programs with confidence. And that needs somebody to orchestrate, somebody to make the case and to follow through consistently, persistently, a la Bruce Benton.
So if there's a next Bruce Benton in the audience, then please pay attention. All right, I'd like to thank each one of the panel members. Did a great job. You were a really disciplined amount of time. And I think we're finishing up here only a couple minutes late. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Patricia to lead us into our next panel.
Yes, a couple of minutes means everything, really. But I will say very quickly, that question about the focus on elimination and integration of the new roadmap was a perfect question for Dr. Malicella, who is coming in on the next panel.